As the giant fell, a deafening roar swept across the valley of Elah. The army of Israel, frozen in fear only moments before, surged forward with renewed courage. The Philistine soldiers, who had mocked the young shepherd, turned and fled in panic. The impossible had happened. One stone, guided by faith, had changed the course of history. When the battle ended, David did not celebrate his own victory. Instead, he quietly lifted his eyes toward heaven, knowing that every step of this journey had been directed by God. The people praised David as a hero, but David's heart remained humble. He understood that true strength never came from a sword or a sling. It came from trusting the Lord. News of the victory spread throughout Israel. Villages echoed with songs of celebration, and families rejoiced that the nation had been delivered. For the first time, the name of David was known across the land. King Saul welcomed David into the royal palace. At first, Saul admired the young shepherd whose courage had saved Israel. David played the harp before the king, and whenever Saul was troubled, the peaceful music brought comfort to his heart. It seemed that a new season of peace had begun. Inside the palace, David met Jonathan, the king's son. Though they had grown up in different worlds, their hearts were united by honesty, courage, and faith. Their friendship became one of the strongest bonds ever recorded. Jonathan recognized that God had a special purpose for David, and instead of jealousy, he chose loyalty. Together they trained, talked, laughed, and encouraged one another. Jonathan even gave David his royal robe, his sword, his bow, and his belt, a remarkable act that symbolized trust and brotherhood. Yet while the people celebrated David's victories, another emotion quietly began to grow inside King Saul's heart. It was not gratitude. It was jealousy. As the crowd sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands," Saul's heart hardened. Every cheer for David felt like a threat to his throne. The king who had once welcomed the shepherd now watched him with suspicion. David remained faithful, never seeking the crown for himself. He continued serving the king with humility, unaware that the greatest trials of his life were only beginning. The shepherd who defeated a giant would soon face a far more dangerous enemy, a king consumed by jealousy. The palace that once welcomed David slowly became a place of danger. King Saul could no longer hide the jealousy burning within his heart. Every victory David won, every song the people sang, and every act of kindness only deepened the king's fear that God had chosen another man to lead Israel. One evening, as David gently played his harp to calm Saul's troubled spirit, the king suddenly gripped his spear. His eyes burned with anger. Without warning, Saul hurled the spear across the room with all his strength. David moved just in time, and the spear crashed into the wall behind him. The palace fell silent. David could not understand why the king wanted him dead. He had never betrayed Saul. He had fought for Israel, served the kingdom faithfully, and honored the man God had placed on the throne. Yet hatred had blinded the king's heart. From that day on, David knew he could no longer remain safely inside the palace. But before leaving, Jonathan, Saul's own son, secretly met him. Jonathan's face was filled with sorrow. "My father has decided to kill you," he whispered. David stood in silence, unable to believe the words. Jonathan took David's hands and said, "The Lord is with you. No matter where life takes you, never forget that our friendship will never be broken." The two friends embraced one another with tears in their eyes. They knew this might be the last time they would meet for many years. That very night, David quietly left the palace and disappeared into the wilderness. The young shepherd who had once lived among green pastures now wandered through rocky deserts, dark caves, and lonely mountains. Every sunrise brought uncertainty. Every sunset reminded him that he was now a fugitive. Yet David refused to allow bitterness to take root in his heart. Instead of seeking revenge, he poured out his fears to God in prayer. Many of the beautiful psalms that still inspire millions today were born during these lonely nights in the wilderness. David had lost his home. He had lost his position. He had lost the comfort of the palace. But one thing he never lost: his faith in God. And while Saul searched the land with thousands of soldiers, God was quietly preparing David for a throne far greater than anything he could yet imagine. The greatest tests of David's life were still ahead. The wilderness became David's home. Cold nights replaced the comfort of the palace, and rough caves became his shelter. Every day, King Saul's soldiers searched the mountains, valleys, and forests, hoping to capture the man they once called a hero. But David was never alone. God faithfully guided every step he took. Soon, others began to find David in the wilderness. They were men who had been rejected, burdened by debt, or treated unfairly. They came searching for hope, and they found it in David. Instead of building an army through fear, David built a family through faith, courage, and compassion. Hundreds of men chose to follow him. Together, they learned to survive in the harsh wilderness. They protected villages from raiders, shared what little food they had, and refused to harm innocent people. Even while running for his life, David continued to live with honor. One day, Saul entered a dark cave without realizing David and his men were hiding deep inside. The cave fell completely silent. David's followers whispered, "This is your chance. God has delivered Saul into your hands." In this today, David slowly walked toward the king. His hand rested on his sword. One step, then another. Saul remained completely unaware. David could have taken the throne in a single moment. Instead, he quietly cut off a small corner of Saul's robe and stepped back into the shadows. As soon as Saul left the cave, David's heart was troubled. He knew that even cutting the robe of the Lord's anointed king had been an act of disrespect. David immediately told his men, "I will never raise my hand against the king. God himself will decide the right time." Then David walked out of the cave and called after Saul, "My lord the king." Saul turned around in surprise. David bowed low before him and held up the piece of the royal robe. "Today I had the opportunity to harm you, but I chose mercy instead. I have done nothing against you." For a long moment, the king stood speechless. Tears filled Saul's eyes. "You are more righteous than I am," Saul admitted. "You have repaid my evil with kindness." For a brief moment, peace returned between them. But David understood something important. Forgiving someone does not always remove the danger. He continued trusting God, knowing the journey was not over. Far beyond the mountains, a new chapter of his destiny was waiting. And soon, the crown that God had promised would come closer than ever before. Time passed, and the conflict between Saul and David continued. Though Saul had briefly admitted David's innocence, the jealousy in his heart returned. Once again, he gathered his soldiers and began searching for David across the wilderness. One night, David and one of his loyal companions quietly entered Saul's camp. The moon shone over thousands of sleeping soldiers. In the very center of the camp lay King Saul, fast asleep. His spear was planted in the ground beside him, and no one was awake to guard him. David's companion whispered, "God has given your enemy into your hands. Let me end this with one strike." David gently stopped him. "No," he said, "I will not harm the Lord's anointed. If God has chosen my future, I do not need to force it." Instead, David picked up Saul's spear and his water jug. Then he quietly left the camp without waking a single soldier. When the sun began to rise, David climbed a nearby hill and called out to Saul's army. The soldiers awoke in confusion. Saul looked toward the mountain and recognized David's voice. David held the king's spear high in the air. "My lord, if I wanted to harm you, I could have done it while you slept. But I chose mercy instead. I trust God to judge between us." Silence covered the valley. Saul lowered his head. "My son David," he cried, "I have sinned. You have shown me kindness again while I have repaid you with evil. May the Lord reward you for your faithfulness." For a second time, David spared the life of the man who wanted him dead. David understood a truth that few people ever learn. Real strength is shown not by taking revenge, but by choosing mercy when revenge is within your reach. Soon after these events, a great battle broke out between Israel and the Philistines. The fighting was fierce. King Saul and his sons entered the battlefield with courage, but the enemy overwhelmed them. By the end of the day, Saul had fallen. The king who had once feared losing his throne was gone. When David received the news, he did not celebrate. He wept. He mourned for Saul and for Jonathan, his beloved friend. Though Saul had hunted him for years, David refused to rejoice at his death. Instead, he honored the fallen king and remembered Jonathan with deep love. The long years of running were finally over. A new chapter was about to begin. The shepherd whom God had chosen was now about to become the king of Israel.